so I have promised to keep this to 10 minutes. One, because I don't want to hear the sound of my own voice for too long, and plus, like you, I just love being able to really explore the books. So I don't want to hold you guys back from that too much. But I am a third year PhD student at the University of Kent. Really blessedly, I am funded by the AHRC. My project is titled, currently, Tracing the Black Knight in Chivalric Literature from North Atlantic Europe, circa 11 to 1500. And what I do, I sort of conduct a literary analysis on a corpus of texts to really understand how blackness is formed and how we can understand blackness. And then really to understand how these texts, their ideas are disseminated and who is taking part in this sort of act of race making. I look at the extant manuscripts from my corpus and try to decide and sort of discern who sort of wanted these books produced, where they ended up, where they were made, sort of to see and make this network of where these ideas were spreading. And why this is important is the discourse that currently surrounds pre-modern critical race studies is extremely broad. So it captures everything from what's going on in England to what's going on in Spain to Italy. And it does it in such a broad sweep that it really obscures the nuances and the complexities of race in different sort of cultural contexts and geographic zones. So that's why, one, I've decided to keep my corpus to North Atlantic Europe. So I look at England, France, the Low Countries and Germany, which is still quite a huge spread, but there are a lot of similarities within the network of texts. And so I also thought, if I'm critiquing this really broad scope, I can't also do the same thing. And I thought, what do I really love? One of those things is chivalric romances. I mean, who doesn't love tales of knights on their escapades? And it's also another really important reason for why I chose these texts. You can sort of think about romance as almost a proto-genre, so this really beginning forms of genre, and the thing that makes genre so important for my work is that it's something that's made up of familiarity and repetition, but also different. And so you have these texts with these very core main elements that for a reader they're like, okay, so this definitely is a chivalric text, and then going further down, this is making it Arthurian, for example. But then what happens when you add that element of difference? You add a black knight, for example, into the mix. And so my main case study is the Middle Dutch text, Morian, which only survives in one manuscript, which is currently in The Hague. It's the Lancelot compilation, and the shelf mark for anyone that wants it is KB129810. It's completely digitized, so it's free to look at. They've done an amazing transcription of all the texts. So it has the end of a Middle Dutch translation of the Lancelot Grail cycle, and then 7 Middle Dutch romances, one of them being Morian. And Morian is, I could wax lyrically about Morian, but for time I will not do so, but anyone can talk to me about it. I absolutely love it. It's such a marvelous text. So Morian is interesting because it's the most tolerant, quote unquote, of the texts that I look at. And this is because Morian, they're not very creative. He is a black knight. He's named after the Dutch word for Moor, but he seeks to go and find his father who abandoned him and his mother. He travels into the Arthurian sphere. He meets Lancelot and Gawain. They see him for the first time, this huge, giant black figure. At this point, he's what I call black with a lowercase b, so you can't see his face. He is just wearing complete black armor. And they exclaim, oh, is this a fiend? Is this a devil? Because they're working with this assumption that blackness is something that's dark, perhaps unholy and sinful. But Morian exclaims to God, and he says, I need you to tell me where my dad Aglaval is. If you don't tell me this, I will have to fight you. You've got no chance of escaping this. This is how the game's going to work. They do say to him, that's not very chivalrous. Perhaps we can have a conversation. Morian says, no, the rules of the game that you won't tell me where my dad is. I need to fight you. So Lancelot, being Lancelot, says, oh, I'll do the fighting because, you know, I'm the best of the Arthurian knights. I'm sure that I can beat you. So they start having a scrap, and someone described it to me yesterday as almost like a Looney Tunes kind of sketch, that these two are sort of scrapping in sort of a dust bubble in the corner, and Gawain is having this almost existential crisis where he's like, okay, so this is very strange. I've got to keep an eye on what's going on here so they don't kill each other. But also, this man, he is incredibly tall. He's got this amazing armor. He's got this amazing horse. This is a really good knight. So why are we now perhaps having a problem? He then does intervene with Lancelot and Morian because they can match each other stroke for stroke. So Morian automatically is pushed farther into this sort of noble courtly echelon because he can match Lancelot, the guy with the most prowess. And so he says, come on, like, let's stop fighting. Let's talk again. We might know your dad. Please tell us more. So Morian recounts the issue with his father. The knights, Lancelot and Gawain, do start crying. So they have this emotional connection to Morian. And this is a complete outsider, which is important for the text. And it's at this point Morian takes off his helmet. And we are told that he has a face as black as coal. He's as black as night and as black as a raven. So they're working within these conventions of really emphasising his blackness. And they do so for what we would think as a quite racist caricature. So they sort of contrast his face with the whiteness of his teeth. But that's really to emphasise his difference. They then go on to say, oh, according to this, you know, he's really tall, he's got great armour, he has an amazing horse, he's actually really handsome, so we really like him there, like he can really fit with us, he's super handsome. And Gawain says, and the Dutch translates to, though he was black, what does that matter? The fact he's black is superfluous to his knightly identity, to his prowess, and to his nobility. Why did we judge him on the colour of his skin? That says more about us and the surface level interaction we had than it does about Morian. And this is an early 14th century text, which I think in the modern sort of understanding of what race is doing in the past, throws into all sorts of questions, because we have this sort of idea, this myth that the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, was this homogeneously white space. But if there were people of colour, they were automatically demonised. And this isn't to say that this doesn't happen. There are evidences in some texts that are used to contextualise Morian that this is the case. But when you have this, you can see that people are starting to think, how do I fit in the world? How do I construct my identity to then understand how I construct the identity and otherness of others? And actually, they aren't too different from us. They're very much the same. So then to get to the books, I do the literary analysis, but that would be sort of acting in some sort of vacuum. I'd just be suggesting that this is how blackness is being created. Who is wanting these and where are they going? And that really then gives me the opportunity to say, okay, race making is happening in these social stratas on these levels. Is it just happening within this sort of courtly aristocratic sphere? Is it happening with merchants in the mercantile sphere? Is it even being pushed down sort of lower? Is this happening across social levels? And from that, I can start thinking about the terms that we use to characterise blackness and the terms that we use to understand race, and sort of really problematise some of the modern terms which carry a heavy amount of semantic baggage, sort of according to colonialism, imperialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. And that's then how I build my foundation to suggest this is how we should look at race in this period. So enough of me.
Yeah, but could you just say for the film?
I'm going to just point out the books now.
Yeah.
So here we have, I think this is Laud. So this is a 3rd quarter 15th century copy of Mandeville's Travels, and you might be asking, what is Mandeville doing here? He's not a chivalric romance, and you'd be correct. But I look at this as a travel narrative and almost a travel romance. So Mandeville is this amazing pastiche of different works of travel that this sort of pseudo-author has put together, and it really helps us to understand how an act of transgression, that border between us and them, is crossed, how it's enforced. And it's this text which really helps me to start thinking about the terms that I use. And then we have a wonderful 15th century copy of the Canterbury Tales. And again, you might ask, what's Chaucer doing here? And for me, Chaucer is one of those texts. I love Chaucer, so selfishly, I did want him here. But he's a text when I discuss with students, especially undergrad students, when you think about literature in the Middle Ages, we often think of the Canterbury Tales, and it's one of those texts which it also does play with conventions of genre. He uses expectations to satirise them, but it's texts like these which then sometimes eclipse these often smaller texts. But of course, it's just lovely to look at, and who doesn't love Chaucer? We then, moving on, have a 15th century copy of Richard Coeur de Lion. So this is a romance which describes the life and exploits of Richard I. This is what we know as the B text, so it's the more historically accurate version of the text. It follows the more chronicle tradition, but there is a more fabulous and, for my personal favourite, A version of the text, which survives in 2 manuscript copies, and that sort of has these amazing romance interpolations. So it removes Eleanor of Aquitaine as his mother, and it gives him a demonic mother, so he has superhuman powers. And Richard, in this other text, enacts 2 acts of cannibalism against the Saracens while he's on crusade. And this is important for me, as this is the most intolerant of the texts I look at. So this is using ideas to really contextualise the jump that Morian makes. So it's just fantastic, and I really like the sort of setup of this. It feels personal. Moving on, we've got another copy of Mandeville. This is a late 14th century, early 15th century copy of Mandeville. This is defective Mandeville, so that just means it's missing the section from Egypt. Again, I just wanted to have sort of 2 differing copies just to see the spread of this text, because it really did enter sort of the cultural zeitgeist and psyche. People loved this text so much so they would have a copy, go on travels, and weirdly implant things they'd read in Mandeville on their travels, which they hadn't seen, but it had entered their sort of mind so fiercely that they would walk along and think, oh, Mandeville mentioned this, so I've seen it. So it could really show the power of what the text has on the imagination of people. And then finally, and perhaps maybe my favourite, don't tell the others, we have a 14th century copy of Summarise. So this is a Middle English translation of the earlier French chanson of the same name. It sort of is within the Charlemagne romances, particularly with Roland and Oliver. But the most, I think, fascinating thing about this text is that the wrapper that survives with it is an earlier draft version of the same text in the same hand. And what some other scholars much smarter than I have decided is this is someone working out how to put the earlier sort of French tradition, translate it into verse and make it work within Middle English. And then they have this finalised version here. So I'd really love you guys to sort of get stuck in, have a look at these books, because for me, I often work sort of the opposite way round. So I have a look at the text and really understand how these characters are interacting and what the text is saying ideologically, or what are the themes. And then I find the manuscripts and I have these things in mind, and then I go back to the drawing board and I don't look at the text, I look at the book and see what the book can tell me. And then it's almost like, okay, here's this puzzle piece, here's this piece from the text, and this is what's happening. Thank you very much for listening to me.